going to talk to you about ethics and classroom teachers. So this is a quote by Professor Carl Hostler, who is an American professor who teaches ethics. And I use it to start this presentation as it summarises the topic of what I'm going to talk about, which is the ethical values of teachers and how teachers' ethical values cannot help but affect the interactions in the classroom and decisions that are made, because ethics is part of a teacher's persona. I've been doing some research on retention of early career teachers, and the importance of early career teachers developing their ethical values in the classroom becomes increasingly important to their retention. However, when I looked further and reflected on my own 18-year teaching career, I began to think about how often are ethical values in teachers discussed across staff in different classrooms. So why do we need to discuss ethical behaviour of teachers? Well, it helps to support teachers if they feel their ethical values are valued and recognised within a school culture, and provides them with the support for making the decisions within their classroom and taking actions in the classroom. Autonomy is a big part of teacher retention, as a report in January 20 by the National Foundation for Education Research found, and that report is titled Teacher Autonomy, How Does It Relate to Job Satisfaction and Retention, if you want to look it up. So at the start of this presentation, I'll be clear and state that I think there needs to be more discussions in education about the ethical moral knowledge that teachers use, and it needs to inform their professional judgments and guide their interactions with students, colleagues and parents. As a teacher educator, I know that much time is spent on developing teachers' pedagogical and subject knowledge. But what about ethical and moral knowledge? How is that acquired? By experience, learning from one's mistakes, talking to other colleagues in an informal or formal manner? How do teachers know when they've got it wrong? Is this when they start to become disillusioned with the teaching profession, when they start to think that perhaps they're the only one that are experiencing certain situations, or I wish someone had talked to me about this? So we all know that teaching is a profession. So a common definition of a profession is that it must provide an important part of public service, involve a theoretical and practically ground expertise, have a distinct ethical dimension in a code of practice, require organisation and regulation for recruitment and discipline, and have a high level of autonomy, independence of judgment. There is part 2 of the teacher standards, but they are essentially describing professional principles rather than guiding about ethical behaviour or judgments. So, for example, there are lots of types of teacher knowledge which I've listed here. But what about ethical knowledge? All of these types of knowledge are developed over time and with experience. But how much time is given to understanding and developing ethical knowledge by classroom teachers and supporting them in this area, just like the ones that are listed here? So this quote by Elizabeth Campbell, who wrote The Ethical Teacher, identifies that teachers need to be aware that their own ethical values inevitably affect their own decision-making and interactions with students, colleagues and parents. There's nothing wrong with that, but there just needs to be time for teachers to be reflective and be aware of their own practice and how it influences the ethical decisions that they make. Elizabeth Campbell conducted her own research and found that many teachers, on an individual basis, strive to maintain an individually, ethically professional environment in their classroom of fairness, honesty, kindness, respect, and be supportive of moral social development of their students. However, she found no evidence of teachers being able to collaborate together in a formal way to foster and extend that type of ethical environment throughout the school. I know that some of you may recognise a collaborative ethical environment in the school that you work in, but equally some of you may not. However, the Ethical Principles of Leadership in Education were published in January 2019 in a document titled Navigating the Moral Maze. They've been collaboratively created by a number of organisations that you'll recognise, such as ASCL and the Chartered College, and they've made transparent the values and behaviours that we would expect of teachers in education. I'm sure that you'll find many of your school leaders are engaging with these, and hopefully more time will be given to developing an ethical culture and community within your school. However, I'm particularly interested in the ethical values that a classroom teacher brings to the classroom and how that affects their daily practice. I'm not advocating for an ethical code of conduct for teachers like the leadership one, as that will just end up being yet another thing in education. But what I am asking for is more conversations about the ethical values in schools and how they're upheld by classroom teachers, and what happens when some teachers find that their own ethical values conflict with the public story of the school. Does anyone take the time to think about this, whether at leadership or at classroom level? Are classroom teachers given the opportunity to discuss any potential conflicts with this public story of the school, and their own values and their own ethics, and what they wish to bring to the classroom? Because as the quote at the start of this presentation said, this issue should not be avoided, as teaching is an ethical activity. I've listed here some questions to encourage you to reflect on your own practice. So reflecting on some of these questions will enable you to think about your own ethical values and how they're reflected in the classroom. As the purpose of this presentation is to encourage you to think about how your own ethical values affect your interactions and decisions that you make every day in the practice of your classroom. So just take a minute to think about some of these and see which ones perhaps you haven't thought about in your teaching practice for a while. None of these are judgments about the quality of teaching, but they are about helping teachers to understand how their interpretations of ethical values of tolerance, fairness, respect, kindness can be reflected in the decisions and actions that they take, regardless of what the school's public values and public stories are. So I'll just leave you with this final quote. I think we just need to make the topic of ethical behaviour and judgments more visible in conversations within schools, so that classroom teachers can have their autonomy and professionalism recognised as their own ethical values are valued within the classroom, within the context of the shared expectations of a large organisation of school. And that is a recognition that sometimes personal ethical values are going to conflict with the ones created publicly by a school, and an understanding of how this conflict could lead to some teachers to become disillusioned with teaching and focus on leaving the profession. And when we have a retention crisis in schools, then perhaps we need to have a greater awareness about this, with more conversations to recognise that sometimes professional ethical values can either align or conflict, and we need to acknowledge this and discuss it in a professional manner. So my final questions to end this presentation with are to ask, who created the public story of the school that you're working in the first place, and the public values of the school? And how long ago was that? And was it by a single person or by a group of teachers? And so to reflect on that, and now think about whether or not there being a difference in ethical values between individual teachers and those promoted by a school. Does this have anything to do with the retention issue that we are facing in the teaching profession?